Please subscribe to this channel for more videos related to Catholic Christian teaching. The primary purpose of marriage is the procreation and education of offspring. The secondary end is mutual help and the morally regulated satisfaction of the sexual instinct. In their efforts to appreciate marriage more as a personal communion, some recent theologians have proposed, against the traditional teaching of the purpose of marriage, that the primary purpose of marriage is the mutual completion and personal perfection of the marriage partners, or their mutual love and unity. The Holy Office in the year 1944, in answer to an inquiry, reasserted the traditional teaching. The Second Vatican Council, which strongly emphasizes the personal character of the marital relationship, mentioned the two purposes of marriage in the conventional order, but without, however, placing the second in subordination to the first. The primary purpose is expressed in Genesis chapter 1. Be fruitful and multiply, and fill the earth and subdue it. The secondary purpose is expressed in Genesis chapter 2. It is not good that the man should be alone. I will make him a helper as his partner. And in 1 Corinthians chapter 7. But because of cases of sexual immorality, each man should have his own wife, and each woman her own husband. The essential properties of marriage are unity and indissolubility. The Council of Trent declared against Luther, who, invoking the example of the Old Testament, recognized the double marriage of Count Philip of Hesse. Christians are forbidden by divine law to have several wives at the same time. The canon was directed against the usual form of simultaneous polygamy, namely polygyny. Polyandry is prohibited by the natural law as it hinders or at least gravely endangers the primary purpose of marriage. God instituted marriage in paradise as a monogamous institution. But mankind soon lapsed from the original ideal of monogamy. Polygamy was widely extended in the Old Covenant also. It was recognized in the Jewish law, which implies a divine dispensation. Christ restored marriage to its original purity. Invoking Genesis chapter 2, he declares, "So they are no longer two, but one flesh. Therefore, what God has joined together, let no one separate." He declares in Matthew chapter 19 that the putting away of a wife and the entering into a new marriage is adultery. And I say to you, whoever divorces his wife, except for unchastity, and marries another, commits adultery. According to the teaching of St. Paul, marriage has a strong monogamous character. In their descriptions of the morally pure life of the Christians, the Christian apologists expressly stress the observation of monogamy. Theophilus of Antioch remarks, "Among them, wise self-control is found, abstinence is practiced, monogamy is observed, and chastity is preserved." Speculatively, the rectitude of monogamy is established by the fact that it alone guarantees the fulfilling of all the purposes of marriage and is a faithful image of Christ's union with the Church. The Council of Trent declared that the bond of marriage cannot be dissolved on account of heresy or of difficulties in living together or the willful absence of one marriage partner, and that the Church does not err when she has taught and teaches that according to evangelical and apostolic doctrine, the bond of matrimony cannot be dissolved on account of the adultery of one of the parties. Both canons are addressed immediately to the Reformers, but the latter applies to the Greek Orthodox Church also, which based on Matthew chapter 5 verse 32 and Matthew chapter 19 verse 9, and the teaching of some Greek fathers, permits the dissolution of the bond of matrimony in the case of adultery. The doctrinal decision of the Council of Trent have in mind Christian marriage only, but according to God's ordinance made at the institution of marriage, every marriage, including the marriage of the unbaptized, is intrinsically indissoluble. To the question of the Pharisees, asking whether it was permitted to the husband to divorce his wife for any reason, Jesus responds by alluding to Genesis chapter 2 verse 24. So they are no longer two, but one flesh. Therefore, what God has joined together, let no one separate. To the objection that Moses commanded that the man give the woman a bill of divorce and then dismiss her, Jesus replies, "It was because you were so hard-hearted that Moses allowed you to divorce your wives. But from the beginning, it was not so." Jesus reestablishes the primitive order created by God by declaring, "And I say to you, whoever divorces his wife, except for unchastity, and marries another, commits adultery." St. Paul proclaims to married people, as a commandment of the Lord, that the woman may not leave the man, and that the man may not put away the woman. But if one party goes away from the other, the deserted party must remain unmarried. The woman who unites with another man during the lifetime of her husband is an adulteress. Only in the death of her husband is she free for another union. The fathers of the first centuries almost all expound the view that in the case of adultery, the dismissal of the guilty party is permitted, but that a subsequent remarriage is forbidden. A defender of the absolute indissolubility of marriage, even in the case of adultery, is St. Augustine. The intrinsic reasons for the indissolubility of marriage are the assuring of the physical and moral education of the children, the protection of marital fidelity, the imitation of the indissoluble union of Christ with His Church, and the welfare of the family and society. While a ratified and consummated Christian marriage, which is a perfect image of the indissoluble union of Christ with the Church created by the Incarnation, is indissoluble as to the bond, and cannot be dissolved by any human authority. It is the centuries-old teaching and practice of the Church that a Christian marriage which has been ratified but not consummated can be dissolved as to the bond either by a solemn religious profession of one partner or by a dispensation of the Apostolic See, granted for weighty reasons. If a married couple continue to live together after one spouse learns of valid grounds for annulment, that may be considered ratification. In the context of marriage, consummation means the actualization of conjugal union after marriage between a husband and wife. Consummation is particularly relevant under canon law, where failure to consummate a marriage is a ground for divorce or an annulment. Pope Alexander III, invoking the example of certain saints, permitted that one of the partners may, before the consummation of the marriage, even against the will of the other, enter the religious state and the other remarry, since they had never become one flesh. Similarly, Pope Innocent III and subsequent legislation Scholastic theology regards the entering into a monastery as spiritual death in which one dies to the world. The beginnings of the papal dispensation regarding a non-consummated marriage go back to Alexander III. The papal power of dispensation was generally affirmed by canonists since the 13th century. In subsequent times, the affirmative view which appealed to the papal practice of dispensation came more and more to the fore, in spite of the resistance of numerous theologians, until it became the general teaching under Benedict XIV. On the ground of the Pauline privilege, if any believer has a wife who is an unbeliever, and she consents to live with him, he should not divorce her. And if any woman has a husband who is an unbeliever, and he consents to live with her, she should not divorce him. A marriage contracted and even consummated between two unbaptized persons can be dissolved as to the bond if one party to the marriage is baptized and the other party refuses to continue to live with him peacefully in the married state. please go to YouTube Retirementality channel, playlist Sacraments for the complete series of these materials.